Hi, welcome to today's Zoom meeting, Pluto in the second house or Taurus. This is intended to be a series going through the natal position of Pluto through the house and signs. I'm excited to welcome everyone here and want to encourage participation. It's always good to have as much collaboration as possible, even if you think your question's stupid, so to speak. There are no stupid questions. Just to keep everybody on the same page. So please, if any questions do come up, right then and there is the time to ask. So with that, we'll go ahead and we'll talk about Pluto being in the sign of Taurus or the second house. From my understanding, and I think many of us would agree who are practicing astrology, that the challenge becomes integrating and synthesizing two archetypes or two signs together. For example, when we're looking at Pluto being in Taurus or the second house, essentially we are synthesizing two archetypes together. We're synthesizing the Scorpio or Pluto archetype together with the Taurus or second house archetype. And remember that Pluto emphasizes, enhances, and magnifies any archetype that it touches. So essentially, when we're looking at Pluto in the second house, Pluto is going to be maximizing the second house archetype. So what is the archetype of Venus, Taurus, second house? The second house archetype at its deepest level, from my understanding, correlates to the survival instinct. We all have a need to sustain ourselves for self-preservation, and that can correlate to many things. It can correlate to the need for, that's the underlying drive for self-sufficiency, to be able to rely or to sustain ourselves through our own efforts. Don't underestimate the survival instinct. It's one of the strongest instincts that any of us can have. So when we're looking at the second house, essentially we're learning how to rely on ourselves. We're learning what resources we have to sustain ourselves. We're looking at how we can go about how we can meet our survival needs. It also correlates to our inner relationship with self, what we value, our self-worth. And in this sense, what we value is going to be linked with meaning. Anything that I give meaning to has survival or is linked with the ongoing need to survive. As an example of this, fire can have a great deal of meaning when that fire can be used for sustaining yourself. Just to give an example of how meaning in this context is linked with our values relative to how we sustain ourselves. The underlying need for self-sufficiency, and again, our inner relationship with ourselves, which is going to be reflected in our values, what we feel we need for survival purposes, and how we go about sustaining ourselves. So when we, Taurus can often be defined as the frog in the well, because it's typically so much focused on survival. Coming from the archetype of Aries, it's where everything is rooted, consolidated, given personal meaning. So it's like slowing down, coming from Aries where everything was arriba, 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 go, 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 andale, andale, andale. We hit the Taurus energy and now it's slow, slow, slow down. It's trying to root, it's trying to consolidate, it's trying to put personal meaning and value to what we've discovered relative to the archetype of Aries. So there can be a very intense inner focus in the sense of the soul trying to identify from within itself what resources it has for self-sustainment. Blending this with the Scorpio archetype then, because when we look at the Scorpio archetype, we're looking at its polarity. We're looking at developing an understanding of the why of things versus just the how. Taurus can be the nuts and bolts. This is how things are put together. When we hit the Scorpio archetype, it's going to be asking why. So essentially, when we're blending this Pluto in the second house, what we're looking at are limitations relative to how the soul is inwardly relating to itself. The need to expose why that soul is inwardly orientated to reality in the way that it is. It's essentially pushing that frog out of the well, exposing it to different levels of reality. And again, this can be very metamorphic, second, eighth house for souls that have a high degree of Taurus energy, because again, self-sufficiency, the intense inner focus, sustaining oneself from within on its own, based on its own self-efforts, all of these things have become a source of security. And again, when we look at Pluto, it's maximizing this archetype. So not to make generalizations, but when we have Pluto in the second house, a limitation quite possibly is that frog in the well orientation. The frog has only identified a small piece of the universal sky, so to speak, but needs to be exposed to more of its own reality, to again developing a psychological awareness of itself and others, of why people are put together the way that they are. Not just the how, but embracing the why. And that can be being confronted to also, again, why the soul values what it does, drawing the soul into an awareness of why it's put together in the way that it is from an eighth house point of view. And as an example of this, one that really helped me clarify my understanding of how these archetypes blend together and the growth points, I remember there was an example given in the Pluto material of a soul who became quite a well-known author, was able to sustain himself based on his own writings for quite a number of years, and yet that soul was unable to adapt to the changing times. So his writings went out of print, his clients diminished, he was no longer able to support himself through his writing. And it was because of that, because of the shock of being thrown back on oneself, having the books go out of print, the dynamics of survival, self-sufficiency coming up to their maximum via the eighth house polarity, that the soul was then able to understand the why of things, why it was that that the soul was unable to accommodate or able to adapt, able to merge. That's also a fundamental part of the eighth house, merging one's resources in a way that's compatible with another's. In this case, adapting the writings to the changing of the times. Second house, eighth house, through the shock of being thrown back on oneself, no longer able to survive, to support oneself based on a resource that was used, being confronted, the inwardly being, the frog is drawn from the well. That's a very basic example, but I hope that it clarifies when we're looking at the second house, because again, the eighth house is maximizing the second house, the types of intensity or the types of dynamics that the soul can potentially be programming. The soul has learned prior to the current life to rely on oneself, second house. Very much going to be orientated towards, again, how can I support myself? What resources do I have? But those resources or it can be that what the soul has identified for survival purposes has become limited, has become a source of limitation that, via the eighth house polarity, will evoke a growth point, or will be points of metamorphosis as the soul is drawn into psychological inner or outer confrontations, being exposed to the why of things. The intention is to embrace deeper levels of reality. Sometimes it can be the soul that investigates the taboo, the eighth house, things that would directly undermine that survival, or that would directly undermine that soul sense of security, or a resource that the soul wouldn't have thought would contribute to its ongoing self-sufficiency. But again, it's merging, it's adapting, it's using those resources in a more evolved way, or in a deepened way, in the eighth house. We can talk about also, I believe it was the inner side of Venus and the outer side of Venus. When we're looking at Pluto in the second house, because Venus rules the Taurus, the sign of Taurus. Venus rules both Taurus and Libra. So Venus has an inner side and an outer side. The inner side of Venus is the Taurus side, the inner relationship with self, identifying from within ourselves what resources we have for self-sustainment. Again, the ongoing need for survival, and what we value. It also correlates to our own self-worth. The external side, or the outer side of Venus, is the seventh house, or Libra. This is going to be the relationships that we attract as a reflection of our inner relationship to ourselves. It's the inner that attracts the outer. It's our inner magnetism. It's how we're relating to ourselves that's going to be the basis, or the determinant of the relationships that we attract with others. And think of this too, there's an inherent inconjunction between the second and seventh house. And this is a naturally existing crisis or stress within consciousness relative to a paradoxical knowledge. What do I inwardly have that I'm able to use to support myself? What resources do I already possess to sustain myself, and so on, versus an awareness of what I need from somebody else. It can be a dilemma of what qualities do I not possess that I would like to, that I see in another. But it's this dynamic of knowing what the soul already has, second house, versus what's in another person. Or what do I need from another person? And it correlates to that in conjunction, or the crisis. In conjunctions manifest as a crisis. In order to balance, it can also be too, I know that we've all experienced this, kind of these fluxes of either when a partner becomes too needy. Seventh house can also be projected needs. When a partner becomes too needy or projects too many needs on us, or vice versa, when we find that we become needy and we project too many needs upon the partner. Crisis, inconjunct, second seventh. So there's this natural balancing that can happen through the second, seventh house as a way to potentially minimize the crisis of the inconjunct. And it can be, let's say, for example, if I find that I'm too needy, I can develop from within myself the resources that were being projected upon the partner. Or I can meet from within myself the needs that were being projected in too much of a way within the relationship, and vice versa. If I find that I'm in a partnership and my partner is suddenly projecting too many needs for whatever reason, um, I can gently promote the awareness of how that soul can meet those needs from within itself. So there can be a mirroring. A seventh house can operate as a mirror of what resources or what tools we have in order to become more self-sustaining, to balance that crisis to where there's more equality, versus the extremes or versus the back and forth of either one soul or the other becoming too needy, or the other soul, and potentially resolving the inconjunct of crisis. Yes, the ongoing need for survival. I think we, especially as Uranus go transits Taurus, we can all relate to this in deeper ways or in more individual ways now, as it's Uranus. Resources. What resources do we have? It can be dynamics that's going on now in terms of uh, um, conservation, of some people trying to use land to grow their own foods, to potentially minimizing any reliance on the external uh, factors, even grocery. I mean, it's fundamental now, but really using everything that we have, any resource that we have, to sustain ourselves with a minimum of dependency or need on the external in general. Survival can also be based upon what we value. Values are an intrinsic part of the second house. So for our ongoing needs, not just for physical survival, but emotional. I would say emotional survival too. If you look at the sign of Venus by house and sign, you'll see what needs the soul has specifically um, within relationships, for an ongoing sense of survival and also continuation of relationships to happen. For example, Venus in the first house, this can be a soul that's going to have a fundamental need for freedom, exploration, independence. Um, it's attracting in development of the independent voice. So I would say, at least from my point of view, that that's also linked to the dynamic for what the soul it needs for its own survival purposes on an emotional level. If that independence is cut off, or if the soul feels that it can't develop its voice, or that there's not an ongoing feeling of movement, first house, in a general sense, that can compete with the overall maintenance of relationship. So from my understanding, survival has both a physical and emotional component to it. Procreation, yes. That's also linked with the survival instinct that procreation is, again, for the survival of the species. And the second house, Taurus, can correlate to our sexual needs, our sexual values, how we orientate to sexuality in general. And via the eighth house polarity, that progressively there can be expansion beyond the soul's current orientation towards sexuality. And in a general sense, sexuality used for simply procreational purposes, as it's evolved into also specific rituals to expand consciousness, also to potentially connect with the creator, the creatus, through merging the eighth house, through merging with something larger than ourselves, two people, and then ultimately with a larger consciousness, the source, the creator. So from my understanding, in the second house, it's our relationship to sexuality, how we orientate to it, Oftentimes, sexuality can have it can be used for either uh, profane purposes or for purposes to psychically renew, to expand consciousness, and also the natural evolution towards sexuality as a tool to merge with the source, or to merge with universal energies. Um, so the evolution of sexuality used for procreational purposes, for deepening, merging through a progressive metamorphosis. Um, so you have a whole spectrum within that archetype, and also in terms of self-sufficiency, there can be desires for self-sex, or there can be, if you look at souls that have a strong second house, part of that can be a natural need for that relative to self-sustainment. My sexual needs are not intrinsically linked with a partner, meaning I can meet those needs whether I'm in a relationship or not. So there's a whole spectrum there, and from my understanding that it's the soul's orientation to sexuality, to how it's orientated to it and for what purposes. And again, a natural expansion from procreation to via the eighth house, um, merging with universal energies and specific rituals to do that. Inner resources. Yeah, that is when we can identify what resources we have to sustain ourselves from a Taurian point of view, we become progressively more self-contained, self-sufficient, relying on ourselves. There can also be a consolidation, or a grounding in, or a rooting into ourselves when we identify those. There can be an identification of resources that we didn't know that we had if we hadn't withdrawn into ourselves, or if we hadn't gone through an inner consolidation process, which, from my understanding, is why part of the reason that the second house or Taurus needs to withdraw cyclically. It's a way of touching base or grounding into its own inner resources, whether those are emotional, whether those are physical in terms of uh, um, like teaching or landscaping, or so on. It can also be emotional. It can be ways that we take care of ourselves. It can be ways that we take care of others as needed, our resources to do that. But these are all coming from the inside. These are inner resources that the second house has identified from within itself, that are not dependent on anybody else. Values. Yes, very much. Values are connected to our inner relationship with ourselves. Um, what we value in terms of, also what we value also again determines overall meaning, or what we value then gives a sense of meaning to our lives. So as an example, if we're looking at Venus, let's say in the ninth house, we're going to be looking at a soul who would intrinsically value um, uh, intuition, being able to express one's personal truth. Can be a soul that's naturally orientated towards adventure. There will have to be a natural philosophical or metaphysical simpatico, a similar outlook, a similar vision with any partner that the soul attracts. Humor, lightness, levity. A soul essentially is learning to relate to itself via its own personal truth, via knowledge of natural laws. And in the ninth house, those natural laws are in a process of growth, expanding, the soul becoming aware of more natural laws that it wasn't aware of before, but essentially valuing personal truth, at times honesty. Um, those can be intrinsic values that the soul has that are then brought into relationships. And here's the big one, self-reliance. That, from my understanding, is one of the deeper one of the deeper meanings of a second house archetype. Self-reliance is that all of us, in one way or another, are learning to rely on ourselves, independent from anybody else. And the second house often becomes or creates a situation where it's thrown back on itself in order to meet its own needs, in order to facilitate that lesson. So many times the second house can draw in situations where they're either left holding the empty bag, where they were fundamentally tasked to rely on themselves, again, to sustain themselves and not dependent on anybody else. So it can also bring a sense of security. Looking at Pluto in the second house, there can be an underlying security mechanism of not relying on anybody else. It can offset fears of having the rug pulled out, of depending on the other dynamics of the chart. Let's say, for example, if we have a Venus in the 8th house squaring the nodes with the soul in the second house, the soul has invested too many resources in others. Let's say Venus was in Libra in the 8th, the rug was pulled out. So as a response to that, natal Pluto in the second house, the soul is going to learn who to commit to, whom not, how much energy to invest, but essentially embracing a fundamental self-sufficiency in order to offset experiences of having the rug pulled out, not being able to sustain oneself, and so on. So there can be, these souls can drive a deep sense of security from knowing that they can support themselves independent from anybody else. And that's a fundamental gift that they can then give to others, or help others learn in their own way, is how to also develop their resources, to become fundamentally self-contained, um, in order to offset challenging experiences, or to grow past dependencies that we have within relationships. Withdrawal. Yeah, very much so. Pluto's in the second house will, emotionally speaking, need cyclic times of withdrawal in order for emotional renewal. The soul replenishes itself through a certain amount of minimizing social contact. It's a stability point. Too much contact can equal dis can can throw the soul out of balance with itself. Um, the soul can lose touch with its own needs, so to speak, with its ability to take care of itself. It can be pulled too much out of itself when there's too much interaction. So the cyclic need to withdraw is really staying grounded or rooted or consolidated with oneself, to recharge, and to minimize too much contact, or to minimize imbalances seen the in conjunction to the seventh house. Staying rooted, staying grounded, in order to again nurture one's root. So it can be a very healthy psychological balance, or it can be a very healthy psychological dynamic. Again, as with anything, it's just when there's too much withdrawal, or the danger point is when there's too much isolation. For example, like referencing back to the example of the soul who wasn't able to adapt their writings to the changings of the times. Too much withdrawal, too much isolation can also lead to implosion. So a healthy amount of withdrawal is a very good thing to help that second house stay stabilized. But too much, and the eighth house archetype, or the frog being pulled out of the well, will also happen. So I guess it's the seventh house, or seeing the inconjunct everything in moderation. By Yeah, from my understanding, the second house Venus is somatic. It can also relate to the senses. So those with the second house can have a heightened sense of either touch, taste, smell, or any variance of those. As an example, I know that a client of mine who had second house emphasized in the chart was very sensitive to both smell and hearing, to noise. Those two senses were highlighted in the chart, and those were ways, or that those somatic responses were ultimately linked with dynamics that were stored in the body, or somatic memories that were had been stored from other lifetimes, and that those specific senses, or the somatic body was emphasized relative to the second house, as the soul was preserving, protecting, self-consolidating. So having those highlighted senses, it was helping the soul therapeutically work through difficult experiences that were carried from other lifetimes. Those weren't totally conscious, but it really helped the soul in terms of grounding into oneself. It would automatically bring up memories, sight, smell, uh, and hearing. Those two things were highly valued as well. So when you look at the second house, those can naturally be ways for the soul for self-therapy. Speaking of self-reliance, that there may be somatic, for example, deep tissue massages, um, parts of the body that can help the soul release, or to purge a buildup of energy, whether that's through the somatic body, or whether that can be through touch. Those can be ways that the soul is naturally orientated towards its own healing at times, for therapeutic purposes, and help the soul stay self-contained. I know that many musicians, or many musicians have a highlighted second house. That's not the only archetype. Second, seventh, 12th can be highlighted, but music, here being connected to the body in that way, to the senses, is correlated to the second house, and can also be natural ways for self-therapy or for the soul to heal. Possessions, yes. Very much so that the soul can be orientated towards what it owns, or it can be orientated towards, let's say, money, its objects. It can range from anything, from being highly valuing money, to those who become a renunciate, and anything in between. So what we're looking at is the value, or the inner orientation, that the soul has towards what it owns. Some can own very little but highly value what it owns. Some can feel a growing disconnection from money, from wealth, from possessions. But it is very Taurian to say, this is mine. It can also do that with others, that it can see others as possessions or objects, and vice versa. The object of possession, via the eighth house polarity, and relating to oneself in a very limited way, or as an object, as something that's owned by another person, and vice versa. Comes down to the inner relationship. So this is a very important dynamic, and again, from my understanding, it's really about identifying how the soul is orientated towards what it has. Um, Again, for the best expression can be those that for them, money is to give, or can contribute as much money as possible to charities. It's not about owning that money for themselves. It's not the money for the sake of the money, but their orientation towards it can be very different. Or again, those that have very little, but very highly value what they have. So the range, and again, the inner relationship, owning somebody else, or relating to oneself as also an object or a possession. Yeah, Pluto's polarity point in the eighth house, then. Again, synthesizing those archetypes, the soul is trying to deepen, is trying to metamorphosize its inner relationship with itself. Via the eighth house polarity point, again, the frog is pulled from the well. There can be pulls towards deeper areas of life. For some, the souls can desire to investigate the taboo, or areas that allow them to develop psychological knowledge that they didn't have before, as a reflection of growing from the how to the why. So when we're looking at the eighth house polarity point, the soul is naturally going to create experiences where it either internally or externally confronts the limitations with respect to its inner relationship with itself, why it values what it does. Let's say, for example, if the soul has had dynamics where it's essentially become a property of somebody else, or has allowed oneself to be owned by another. Essentially, the second house can manifest as a living through somebody else's values, living through somebody else. The eighth house is going to expose these types of limitations as to why the soul has either lived through somebody else, or um, uh, has allowed oneself to become owned, so to speak, by somebody, or are creating situations where they're limited in that way. Um, uh, Throwing the soul back on itself through the question of why. So when you are working with those that have a second house, what you can energize or encourage is that underlying need to rely on oneself, self-effort, self-worth, self-value, and it's always encouraging them to ask the deeper questions to why have they uh, why do they value these things? Why is it that they put themselves together this way, so to speak? Kind of pulling them out of that how, and again, moving towards psychological awareness and encouraging that they have the resources that they need, independent from a relationship with anybody else. So that the union with somebody else can be very positive. It can create a natural expansion, or it can create a deepening of both people to where both people can merge their resources in a non-manipulative way and can become something bigger and brighter than before. So pulling them out of that through the question of why. Okay, so now that we've come this far, we can stop for any questions before we move to example charts. Okay, so before we go into the examples, we can also talk about the different levels of expression through the consensus, individuated, and spiritual. It's very important to understand that the stage of evolution is going to dramatically impact the expression of Pluto in the second. So when we're looking at the second house and the consensus, it's the soul learning to rely on itself relative to the values of the consensus. It can very much be what resources do I have to get ahead in society. So it can be the soul moving from the lower ends of just basic survival, the most basic nuts and bolts job, to progressing through the social strata. These are the resources I have to do it. So it can potentially become a soul that financially becomes very well off, can put a lot of energy into going through the ranks, so to speak. And the inner relationship is changing as well relative to the ongoing self-effort that the soul is putting into evolving through the consensus. And the very best expressions, these can be souls that again gain finances and then give back. In the third stage consensus, this can be a soul that energizes or that gives to many charities, creates union with those collaborations with others, unions with others, where that's a shared or common value. Second house, eighth house. That's the best expression. When we're moving in the individuated state, the soul is liberating, breaking free, progressively identifying its own values as independent or separate from the consensus. Because these can be souls that are actively rebelling or rejecting the status quo, and in that way being thrown back on themselves. Again, to identify what do I value, what resources do I have in the individuated realm to sustain myself. Moving on up through the individuated state. Um, and then so there will be a high degree of value upon individuality. The souls will most likely have an inherent respect and also put a high worth on the individuation process, on establishing one's values that are unique to oneself. When we move into the spiritual state, these are souls that are going to highly value resources that they can give back in some way. The relationship with themselves will ultimately be linked with their connection with Source, with the Creator, Creatus, and so on. When it's in the second house, it's that the soul is learning to deepen, or the soul is learning other ways that can deepen its relationship to source, and that can become its deepest sense of self-preservation, or its deepest sense of self-sustainment is through that relationship, and how that can then be a source of self-sufficiency. So these souls, for example, could orientate towards most common, most commonly a resource that is a reflection of their capacity to give back to others as direction from the source. So this can be a soul that uh, uh, highly values highly values it can be uh, it can be self-sufficiency through the connection with source, so helping people through dependencies, helping through promoting a fundamental connection to source as a way of working through. So these souls will be most times highly motivated towards helping souls discover and recover inner resources that they have to connect with source as ways for self-sustainment. So helping souls identify places where they can promote self-care and minimize any dependencies on others in general. So looking at this first example chart then, Chris Martin from Coldplay. It's one of my favorite musicians. He's got Pluto and Libra in the second house. He's got South Node in Aries conjunct the planetary ruler, the North Node, Libra in the second house. So what we're looking at here is a soul that's been thrown back on themselves in order to learn these lessons of self-sufficiency, self-sustainment, to potentially provoke or evoke the lessons of how he's put together, for what reasons and why, through relationships. I think one of the lyrics that really captures this is from the song Fix You. He says, um, lights will guide you home and ignite your bones, and I will try to fix you. But high up above or down below, when you are too in love to let it show. But oh, if you never try, you'll never know just what you're worth, and I will try to fix you. So this soul has been in a second house way via the South Node in Aries in the 8th house, initiating relationships where there became a dynamic of him becoming a source of security, dependency, reliance upon him in order to help others find their voice, their own need for autonomy and independence. He became the fixer. The sun in Pisces, the Mercury also in Pisces in the 6th, and in that way throwing him back on himself. And if you don't try, you'll never know what you're worth. So he's being thrown back on himself also to promote the lessons of his own self-worth, independent from the relationships with others, to where there can be a mutual or co-equal desire to help one another. South Node or North Node being in Libra in the second house, with Venus and Aries there too. There can be a mutual drive to rediscover each other's voice within the relationship, to psychologically deepen, seeing the 8th house, so that can be shared, where there can be a mutual sense of support, helping one another find each other's voice in an equal way, where both partners have equal value, common values as well, North Node being in Libra in the second. So essentially, dynamics of self-worth, wanting to help, wanting to heal others, wanting to fix you, and boom, that creating uh, the confrontations of the 8th house, or the potential frictions and the tears running down the face in a good way, There's the release, or then there's the renewal that comes after that. Again, you'll never know. If you don't try, you'll never know just what you're worth. So his music, very second, seventh house, being able to give. I would also say with the Pluto being in Libra and North Node being in Libra, a new way to give, within relationships where again it's co-equal, shared values, to where there's more of a balance versus the extremes, and essentially rescuing at times, um, and starting a new relationship pattern, with Venus on the South Node, breaking free or releasing that. So in a sense, it's almost like finding yourself or reawakening to your authentic voice through the shakeup, or through the release, and then finding an even deeper way to give, which can always satisfy the Libra. Oh, new beginnings. Now you're in the most evolved state, at least from my point of view. Swami Sri Yukteswar, he has Pluto and Taurus in the ninth house, the South Node being in Scorpio in the third house, ruled by that by the Pluto being in Taurus in the ninth refers back to that. And then the North Node also in Taurus, conjunct Mars in Taurus, which would be ruled by Venus, which is in Gemini in the 11th. And from my understanding, he was always somebody that encouraged in the best possible sense one's development of self-effort, of relying on oneself, of being able to identify from within oneself capacities one had to ultimately to not only to persevere, but to unlock problems, or to create ingenuity. I know that his words were often very blunt, beyond the point of most people's tolerance. But those were meant to, with the South Node being in Scorpio, to throw you back on yourself. Very second house to remove the parts that weren't meant to be there anymore, so to speak, or the parts that were the ego trying to essentially cling. When we cling to ego consciousness, I think he called it, versus allowing a natural expansion to happen through the release of our limitations, the release of our illusions, and so on. But looking at the Taurus energy in the ninth house, natural teacher, most comes out through his ability to have people connect to this on their own, not just taking other people's words for it, not just reciting, not just memorizing, but really creating their own inner relationship and their own interpretations of these things. Relative to Venus being in Gemini in the 11th, the ruler of the North Node being Mars, or the ruler of the North Node being in Taurus, also in the ninth house conjunct Mars. One of his quotes is, "Keen intelligence is two-edged. It may be used constructively or destructively like a knife, either to cut the boil of ignorance or to decapitate oneself. Intelligence is rightly guided only after the mind has acknowledged its inescapability of spiritual law." So we can see in that one quote, this Taurus energy is used to boil down or to slice to the root, seeing the South Node being in Scorpio in the third, to natural spiritual laws, to natural spiritual principles. Intelligence correlates to Aquarius, 11th house. So Venus and Gemini in the 11th. Intelligence has two applications. And we can see that you can either use intelligence, as he's saying, of course, very manipulative, very destructive ways, or to slice through the layers that no longer serve, to deepen our relationship with self, to deepen our connection with source. So essentially teaching us how to ground into through intense wisdom. He was I think he was called an avatar of wisdom, an incarnation of wisdom. So those arrows, it's to extract anything else but the root, or to extract anything else but the true essence or the true meaning of spiritual laws. Pluto being in Taurus in the ninth house. This is also, I think, a really great quote that can illustrate this in terms of self-effort, self-value, how we relate to these things. He says, many teachers will tell you to believe, and then they put out your eyes of reason and instruct you to only follow their logic. But I want you to keep your eyes of reason open. In addition, I will open in you another eye, the eye of wisdom. So essentially he's saying, don't trust me, don't take my word for it. Here's the resources that you can do to do this for yourself. And from what I understand, that he was always very frugal, but he always had what he needed. Seeing this packed seventh house, um, uh, that he was never extravagant, but he made investments in what he needed to, and as a result, was always taken care of on a physical level, monetary level, and so on. Um, so from my understanding, the expression of the second house in this case is very much connected to underlying principles, natural laws, Taurus in the ninth, self-efforts to not just memorize, not just learn, not just to indiscreetly take in intellectual information. I remember a story where somebody had memorized a spiritual scripture and was able to recite from heart, from memory, every quote. And Sir Yukteswar said, but yes, and what meaning does this have to you? How have you made this meaningful in your own life? And from my understanding, that's looking at Taurus in the ninth house. It's encouraging people to really make these things personal, or to really put personal application, not just to memorize just in that, but to make it their own, to really make that a founding principle in their own lives, in a very real, or in this context, Taurian second house, in their daily lives. Gave them resources to do this. Lived very simply, yet very happy. Which is also very Taurus. So an avatar of wisdom, and how to develop resources to shed or to purge, seeing the South Node in Scorpio, uh, illusions, delusions, ignorance, and to boil down, or to be able to grasp the underlying root, or the underlying essence of natural laws, spiritual laws, and so on. So in closing, unless there are any questions, when we're looking at the second house coming through Pluto, or Pluto in the second house, what we're looking at is essentially the souls who are learning lessons of self-sufficiency, self-reliance, that there's a strong survival, the survival instinct is magnified, and that it's shifting or evolving into understanding the limitations of their inner relationship, why they're put together, in what ways to deepen, to gain more psychological knowledge than they had. In this case, seeing Sir Yukteswar, and seeing the eighth house polarity then being Scorpio in the third house. We could see that happening. He was writing books. Astrology, seeing the Venus in the 11th house ruling that north node. So it was essentially boiling his knowledge or funneling his knowledge through something like it was coming through the linear. His ability to communicate was coming through psychological knowledge, what some would consider taboo, Scorpio, but it was giving it a funnel, or it was giving it a place where it could, in a condensed way, communicate just a tremendous amount of natural wisdom built up through his own evolution, or built up through his intuition, ninth house, being able to naturally bring this to others. In some cases, ninth house can evoke or spark intuitive wisdom in others, which is, from my understanding, his work was able to evoke that, or was able to encourage others to deepen in that way. So writing third house, being able to find a condensed way to deliver or to communicate the deep knowledge of spiritual laws. So we can see that through the evolutionary states, that the soul is progressively defining its values, potentially deepening itself through psychological knowledge. Again, coming through the consensus, individuated and spiritual, that will be specific to evolutionary state. But how these souls can carry a natural gift of helping people rely on themselves more deeply, to expose the roots of limitations, can provide a tremendous amount of self-therapy tools, and can really be quite adept at helping people who are identifying their own resources, to develop a deeper sense of self-worth, and to transmute dependencies in general. And that can be a natural point of evolution, as the soul progresses, is to, again, to go from the how to the why. So any questions or any uh, uh, final thoughts about Taurus second house, Pluto in the second, before we go to closing?
Okay, we don't have any questions. So, Deva, any final thoughts?
I would say generally working with, if you find that you have a lot of second house energy, that the best thing you can do for yourself is to deepen the resources that can be also compatible with others as well. That can be one of the toughest points of the second, eighth house, is merging those resources in a way that creates an energy of higher and brighter. So I would say, looking at the second, eighth house, to only merge when it feels that there's the potential to unite in a way where it becomes something better, or where it can potentially magnify two people's gifts or two people's resources by doing so. And that in that way there can be a very healthy merging, there can be a very healthy union, and that can create a natural pathway into the eighth house. So always bank on that, bank on the skill of self-sufficiency, that the second house will naturally bring that into endeavors with others, that they can promote awareness of that for others too. So it may not be something that others initially value, but always remember that that's one of the best gifts and one of the deepest strengths that you can potentially offer. Um, so to enter into any union or to any partnership with that in mind.
Okay, David, thank you very much. That brings us to the end of your meeting. And we're looking forward to catching you for Pluto in the third house, or Gemini, in about a month. So thank you from all of us.
Thank you. Look forward to next time.